Welcome to the Church of Mabus radio show. It's Friday night, 7:04 p.m. Central. We got Dacre Stoker here, and that's Dacre Stoker. I said it right.
You
Okay, I
got
was
it
saying
right.
it over and
Absolutely.
over since you told me. Then I get nervous. Like, did I just say that right? Yes, you did. Okay, that's good. But great to have you here. I'm definitely looking forward to it. Jay will be here in a second. And I guess when did you know that you were related to Bram Stoker? I mean, was it a revelation, or did you always know it in your family?
Well, Jeff, I got to tell you, I was a quick learner, and it was like in the delivery room. I came out of the womb, and there was the doctor holding a crucifix, and it's like, holy jeez, there must be something going on here. But no, in all seriousness, here's the way it goes. So a little family history is needed to sort of explain the sort of landscape. So Bram was one of seven children, and his youngest brother George Stoker was my great grandfather. So I knew about George Stoker. He was actually kind of a famous guy. He was the inventor of ozone therapy. He was a doctor. He was they're all Irish, born and raised just outside of Dublin. But George was sent off to the Turco-Russian War to be like the Red Cross ambulance back in the day. This is late 1800s. He actually sent letters back to Bram that I'm convinced helped Bram decide to set the story in the Balkan region, Dracula, years later. And George actually lived with Bram while he was going through his medical training when Bram had moved to London to work in the Lyceum Theatre. So I was primarily, as a kid growing up, 10, 11, 12, I was aware of our famous great grandfather, but it was, Halloween time when people would come to the door and go, oh, the Stoker household, what's going on? Are you guys going to give us any candies or take our blood? Ha, ha, ha. And this was, Montreal, Canada. I had no idea what they were talking about. And my dad finally said, well, son, come on, I'm gonna have to tell you. So he went to our library and pulled out a book, and it was the first edition of Dracula that had been passed down from along the family lines from Bram. He gave it to his mother. He signed it to his mom. She read it. She then passed it on to another one of Bram's brothers, Richard, who moved to British Columbia, Canada from England. And then they stayed there. He died. He passed it on to his wife. His wife signed it, and then somehow it went to my dad and on to me. And that's the first book at the about age of 12 or 13 that I looked through, the first edition of Dracula, which I'm kind of embarrassed to say I actually cut my teeth and got to know the story on a first edition signed by Bram to his mother, which is worth, hundreds of thousands of dollars. But I didn't really understand the story or get into it until I was in university, and then I chose to do a oral interpretation of literature about a particular author. That was something in an English class, and I chose to do Bram. And luckily by that time, um, two Boston College professors, McNally and Florescu, wrote a book called In Search of Dracula, and that is what really I got my best understanding of my famous relative by reading what these two professors wrote. I then became this, in college, this sort of expert in the family because I'd read the one book. And then I started, gathering other biographies. Of course, Bram didn't write an autobiography. He died in 1912. He didn't, really talk much about himself as a person because he was so caught up in being the theater manager for Henry Irving. So there's this huge void of information, not just in the family, Jeff, but also, in the sort of the world of any firsthand knowledge or firsthand source material that Bram wrote about himself and writing anything about Dracula. You've got to search for this stuff. And that's what I've been doing for the past 12 years, kind of like finding little pieces of a puzzle. And I'm joined, luckily, by many scholars who do the same thing. And it's a pretty cool community. We're into sharing. So whenever anybody finds something that helps somebody else, we all share. And one of the clearinghouses is our website, bramstokerestate.com. We put stuff that we find. Other researchers put stuff on there that they find. And it's really helpful because it helps us demystify and understand, who my relative really was. So that's the short version of what I've been doing since as a kid, and then college in the last 12 years, digging in libraries, digging in archives, different museums, finding stuff through other people as well.
It's interesting about the book that you have. It reminded me of a book that an author that's been on Don Webb told me about, Forrest J. Ackerman, the guy that did Famous Monsters of Filmland, that magazine.
Yep.
But he has a Dracula book. Well, he's dead now, but and it had like all the autographs of like everyone that's played Dracula, like in movies, like from way back. I don't think it had the Marno or anything like that, or Shrek, or I doubt it had that one, but it had like Bela Lugosi and just all these people in it. It's pretty cool if you think about these strange historic books laying around like that. And that
I've heard about that book, Jeff.
Oh, okay.
It's funny you say that because, my wife is really into ancestry stuff. So she's got Google alerts for all these things, anything to do with Bram Stoker, Dracula, all this stuff. And this book came up to auction. Forrest died not too many years ago, right? And it came up for auction. And I saw the image of all of these signatures. And of course, people, always give me stuff. And somebody had gotten maybe a screenshot of that, and they photocopied it, and they gave that to me at a convention. Oh, here's something. You got to have this. Would you sign this book for me? Yeah, sure, no problem. And so I have one of those, Jeff. It's so cool to see that Ackerman was really diligent in getting guys that have played Dracula on stage as well as on screen. So the original, I'm not sure how much the original book went for it. It could have been, in the hundreds and hundreds of thousands, because that's pure gold right there.
That's cool that you know about it for sure. I've always loved Dracula since I was a kid. I have a big tattoo of the Bela Lugosi Dracula carrying a woman down a mountainside. After my father passed when I was younger, I went crazy and got a tattoo, and it was Dracula. And collect a lot of things, different books and Vlad stuff, and weird Nosferatu figures. Those can get really weird and out there and outlandish. And there's even some strange Vlad ones that I forget the company that made it, but I have one that's worth about $200 of Vlad the Impaler. So I've always been into it for sure, and love that stuff, and just the history behind Vlad and how it got intermingled, into Dracula is very fascinating. And I'm kind of curious of some of your thoughts on that, like the historical, how did he come across Vlad the Impaler? What's some of the history of that?
Well, I'm glad you asked, because a lot of people just sort of assume things that Bram Stoker knew. A lot of biographers, take leaps of faith. But I'm going to tell you on your show right now, guys, that I've seen the books that Bram used for his research. They are, it's not a mystery. They were actually books in two different locations. One in Whitby in Yorkshire. They've actually got the names of the books that he signed out. And one of them was a book by a guy called William Wilkinson, The Account of Principalities of Wallachia and Moldavia. And Bram took an excerpt from that book that mentioned the name Dracula. So, of course, I've, go on to A Books, and I purchased a reprint of that book. I didn't go buy the original for 10 grand, for about $25-30. I just get a reprint, and I read the whole book to find out what was at Bram Stoker's disposal when he was on that holiday in Whitby in 1890 when he started writing Dracula, and what did it say about Dracula. And what was really cool is that we've got these 125 pages of notes sitting in a museum in Philadelphia. So you've got those as a reference point. And two friends of mine, Dr. Elizabeth Miller and Robert 18 Basang, two scholars who have both passed away in the last 2 years, they actually transcribed those notes and published those notes. They are a great resource if you're into this. Jeff, if you haven't already got one, unfortunately, they're out of print, so you got to go dig them up on eBay, but highly recommend Bram Stoker's Notes for Dracula. And what it actually shows is the words Bram took from the Wilkinson book and how he incorporated those into his notes and how he incorporated those into the novel. And for the short version of this is the book said that the name Dracula was used to get, for somebody who displayed unusual, cunning, and cruel actions towards others. It also meant dragon. And so you look at the history, and as you know, his father, Vlad's father, was Order of the Dragon, which was sort of this early crusaders to fight off the invading Ottoman Empire. So you get a little bit of Order of the Dragon being Dracula, and he was the son of a guy who was Order of the Dragon, so they add an A at the end of his name, Dracula, and it gives for somebody who displays cruel action or cunning. In the novel, in two places, when Van Helsing is explaining to the band of heroes who this Count Dracula was, he says, and he displayed this cruel action and cunning. So he's actually taken those words right from that book and slot them in. So we know for sure, Jeffrey, that he got information there. Funnily enough, that same book was also in the London Library, that just 2 years ago, the guy who runs the fundraising for the library, Philip Spedding, contacted me and Robert Bassang, who I was working with writing an annotated Dracula, and said, guys, I've made an interesting discovery. It's a little weird, but I need you to look at this. I need your input. And when he told us this, within a week, both of us flew to London. We had to see this and help verify. And this is what it was. It was so cool that all of the 26 books that Bram had listed in the back of his notes, all his sources, they were there in the London Library, still in general circulation. And so Philip had gone through the stacks of books and pulled them out, brought them to his office, and started looking through the books. And what he saw was that somebody had made all these very conspicuous marks in the margins, underlined things, check marks, NB for nota bene, which is a kind of a shorthand for take note of this, and other weird little cryptic messages, mem. It is exactly what Bram Stoker did in his notes for Dracula. And furthermore, I was able to help verify that this was Bram's work because I was in possession. One of my cousins, Bram's great-grandsons, had loaned me a 1900 edition of Dracula that Bram used when his publisher said, would you please help me create the first paperback abridged version of Dracula? You need to cut out 30,000 words. So what you see in this book that I had, I've since given it back, but I photographed every page, was the same kind of markings and scratch outs and notes that Bram was writing in his own book that he did in the London Library books. And on top of that, two of the books that were in the library, Bram's son had donated them to the London Library after Bram had died. And guess what? Exactly the same markings in the margins. So this gives us really unequivocal evidence of what caught Bram's eye. And then if you cross-reference what was in those books to what was in his notes, and then what made it in the novel, it all is a parallel stream. So once again, Vlad the Impaler pops up, not just in the Wilkinson book, but by a book by a guy called James Samuelson, who was sort of an adventurer and a lawyer who wrote about Vlad the Impaler and doing these horrible things to his own people in order to scare them into following him as he was trying to rouse up an army to hold off the Ottoman Empire. So what this does, guys, is it blows the top off what people used to say up until this discovery. Oh, Bram Stoker knew nothing about Vlad the Impaler. He only saw the name Dracula in a book by Wilkinson. Well, that's not correct anymore. This book by Samuelson with the notes, the marks and so on, tells that this guy did impalement. He did nail the turbans onto visiting Muslims. He was a horrible guy. And basically to wrap this up is Bram needed somebody with an interesting and appropriate history to use his name and his persona for his devil incarnate, this Count Dracula. So he took a prince from Wallachia and moved him next door, which is like going from Georgia to South Carolina, from Wallachia to Transylvania, and just moved him here, took his history with him, moved castles around a little bit, but made it familiar enough so that the history was pretty darn close. And people to this day think, this is, Bram Stoker was really trying to latch on to the exact history, but he got some of it wrong. No, I have to tell you, he got it right. He was just using, because it is a fictional story after all, using it to suit his needs. So that's the link, guys, between Vlad the Impaler, Vlad Dracula III, and Bram's Count Dracula. It was a convenient merger of history and names. And if it wasn't for that name, the name we would have been stuck with that was originally Bram's choice was Count Wampir, which was the name of a vampire in Austria, where Bram was originally going to set the story before he saw the Wilkinson book and the Samuelson book and moved the whole thing to set it in Transylvania.
That's definitely fascinating for sure. There's some old black and white movie called that Vampire or something like that. It's like a silent film or something weird. I've never seen it, but I know I've come across it. One kind of off the cuff question, and you may have heard this term before, maybe not. You ever heard the term scholomance? Is supposed to be like some dark art school. Like, I've asked Don Webb about that. I've seen it somewhere, but there's not many people that really know that much about it. Have you come across it or learned anything about it? Like, it's kind of a weird little thing. That's a strange little story.
Well, it's a good story, Jeff, and I'm glad you've asked that as well. We're on a winning
roll.
streak.
Dracula sink.
No, but a guy like you who's into this and a lot of this stuff. These are the things that make a difference, because what did Bram Stoker know about this country that he never went to? He relied upon the books that he read in the libraries and the contacts that he had. This was a country that not a lot of people knew about back in the days when Bram wrote the story between 1890 and 1897. And so essentially the civilized world, London, which is the center of the universe as far as the British were concerned, where Bram was living when he wrote the story, as far as they were concerned, the civilized world ended in Budapest, Hungary. After that, it was this wild frontier heading towards the Black Sea and the Ottoman Empire. And so they just knew there was a lot of weird stuff, a lot of weird religion, mixing of culture, of superstition. Bram latched on to a Scottish lady named Emily Gerard. She lived in Jedburgh, not too far from Edinburgh. And this is wild, but bear with me.
Okay.
When Bram was doing his research, yet again, Oscar Wilde's mother, who Bram was quite close to, she was very interested in Irish superstition. And she was a mentor to Bram in his writing, because his father kind of poo-pooed anything creative that Bram was doing and wanted him to stick with his job as a civil servant. So he kind of gravitated to these soirees, they call them, these literary soirees. Well, Lady Jane Wilde wrote a book called Irish Folklore and Superstition, and in it, it mentions Transylvanian superstitions, and Emily Gerard wrote a book about it. So he gets this hint that Emily Gerard, the Scottish lady, has written a book about Transylvanian superstitions that include things like vampires. So that's the beginning of this chain. Guess what? In the London Library, there's this 2-volume set of books by Emily Gerard called Land Beyond the Forest. In the one interview that Bram was ever asked to give about writing Dracula by a lady named Jane Stoddard in the British Weekly, it came out 3 months after he wrote the story. She said, "Where did you get this information?" "Oh, Emily Gerard's essay, Transylvanian Superstitions, gave me a lot of information." It's now in a 2-volume book called Land Beyond the Forest. So, of course, I go and buy these books and I read up. And guess what's mentioned in there, Jeff? The Scholomance. Guess what's in Bram's notes that he extracts from her essay and her books? The way you can kill a vampire, the way a vampire is created, the way these superstitions believe vampires can get around, the referencing the term Strigoi, Nosferatu. So she has mentioned, and because Emily Gerard actually moved to Transylvania, she married a fellow who was in the Austrian-Hungarian Empire. He was a Polish cavalry officer. And she got really into not only Scottish superstition, but when she was there, Transylvanian. And she mentioned up in the mountains above Lake Hermannstadt, there is the Scholomance, the School of the Dark Arts. Well, what does Bram do? Oh, this would be perfect. I'll use this as the place for Vlad the Impaler, or whoever my Dracula is, gets turned into a vampire. So he, again, cherry picks superstitions that have a basis in Transylvania that suit his needs. And Van Helsing mentions, yes, he learned his art in the School of the Dark Arts called the Scholomance above Lake Hermannstadt, almost word for word out of the Emily Gerard book. So it's a subtle little piece, but it's the only thing in the novel Dracula that leads the reader to any kind of evidence that Bram was saying, this is where Dracula learned to become the vampire. Of course, movies, and particular Jim Hart, the screenwriter for the 92 Coppola version, he's used his own mythology, which changed the story, but it was cool. It was good. But
Yes.
the original is the Scholomance. And just as you said, bingo, right out of Transylvanian superstition. It's the real deal.
Yeah, that's definitely fascinating. What do we know about Stoker? He had a childhood illness. What do we know about that?
Strangely, not too much. Again, it goes back to the fact that he didn't leave us much information to go on. But in one book that he wrote about his famous employer and boss and friend, Henry Irving, he wrote, just 2 years after Irving died, he wrote a tell-all about it called Personal Reminiscence of Henry Irving. Now, Henry Irving would have been like nowadays George Clooney, Brad Pitt, all rolled into one, the biggest actor stud going. And so Bram was his manager for 27 years. He was very well known for that. So he writes a story of his, the things that happened with him and Irving over 27 years. But he does say that he had a difficult childhood himself, that for the first 7 years of his life, he didn't know what it was like to stand upright. He was very ill, and he had plenty of time to develop this sense of a dark sense of imagination. So that's what he leaves us. There's nothing in the family notes or stories of what it was. My theory is this, that he had very bad respiratory allergies and asthma. We know that one of his brothers did as well. So it would make sense that he was incapacitated because they were living right on the ocean in this suburb called Clontarf. So it would have been very musty and mildewy. The mattresses in those days were essentially hay or straw covered in linen. So if there's any allergens floating around, they are breeding in that stuff, and your face is on it the whole time. And they did not obviously have albuterol or puffers or inhalers. And so he would have suffered from that. But to go a step further in my amateur medical diagnosis, when they moved inland a couple miles to a drier community, he outgrew it at the age of 7. Like many people do outgrow asthma. And he became a champion athlete when he went off to university. So he had a very robust cardiovascular system. So it wasn't something like rheumatic fever or scarlet fever that would have scarred him and made him an invalid for more than just 7 years and have a complete turnaround. So that's what we think we know. What I have used with that, Jeff, and you've read Dracula, we talked about it in pre, that when you make a miraculous recovery, there had to be something going on there. And I think that he was bloodlet by one of his famous uncles. He had 2 famous uncles who were famous bloodletters. And that was high science of the day. And I found on the internet an actual treatise on how you do bloodletting, what is involved, especially what do you do on kids. And this will freak you out a little bit because it's plain as day. Dr. Edward Alexander Stoker says, we don't really know how much blood to take out of these people, but you take out enough, either by cutting them or leeching them until they faint. And
Gosh.
once they faint, take off the leeches, put a plaster on the incision, and then you rehydrate them with a mixture of oil, olive oil or some kind of oil, and claret, which is red wine, alcohol to cleanse and kill everything. Also, if you had just made a kid faint, lack of blood, he's going to need fluid to rehydrate, and you give him oil and alcohol, he's going to be drunk for about a day or so.
Yeah.
So he's going to be in this kind of weird ass stupor, just sort of like, So no wonder he developed this a vicious and dark sense of imagination with either a ladies in white coming along or a doctor cutting him or leeching him and then making him drunk after a horrible experience. So that's what I've kind of given you a combo of what we know and what I think I know based on circumstantial evidence, that it was a difficult childhood, but he recovered and went on to become a champion athlete and went on to excel as a student athlete at Trinity College.
And then I know there was another medical story about the brain operation that was performed on Renfield that paralleled to a real story by the Dr. Thornley Stoker as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of cool when you think of the family itself. I mentioned at the top of the show, 7 children. Bram's eldest brother, the first kid in the family, goes on to become a very famous medical doctor. He's actually knighted Sir William Thornley Stoker. He was the head of the Royal College of Surgeons of Dublin, all of Ireland in Dublin. He actually practiced both regular medicine and also medicine on people who were judged to be insane. So he had interest in 2 levels of medicine, the physical and the emotional mental. So Bram asked him to become his medical advisor on the novel Dracula. So, now we know where all the inside scoop came on Renfield. And the actual, as Jay said, the diagrams are in Bram's notes that Thornley wrote, how to do brain trephination on Renfield in chapter 21. And so it's Thornley's handwriting. It's all right. And then when I look through the manuscript that the Paul Allen estate owns out in Seattle, Thornley's handwriting is all over it, correcting Bram. Oh, you wouldn't use this type of knife on a post-mortem. This is what you do for blood transfusion. The guy wouldn't be sitting down. He'd be lying down. You do this, this, and this. So it's great. It's like having a home team, the home family help you. So, yeah, there was a lot of Bram trying to get it right, to make the feeling that the novel was absolutely correct, which has driven people to think, oh, it's a work of nonfiction. He got certain things wrong. No, it's still fictional, but he made it feel so right that people kind of created what they call a willful suspension of disbelief to make them think it was potentially really right and therefore a really scary story.
And the Francis Ford Coppola one that definitely was a good one, but there was changes, and I don't remember exactly what they were. There's just different things. I always found it interesting how he was there for Mina, but then suddenly he's werewolfing the other chick, in the sex scene. And it's like, well, come on, dude. I thought, he traveled over oceans of time, and here you are. And another strange question that I almost wasn't going to ask you, but Dave Morris was on recently about Stoker and the occult, and he just does like little videos on his channel. But one question I asked him, and I actually had to look up this to make sure I read this right, and it's kind of weird, and I'll probably get embarrassed asking it, but in it, Dracula, it says he has hairy palms. I'd like to talk about Dracula's appearance, and that actual thing, is that kind of a sexual reference? I've always wondered that, and you'd be the guy to ask, I'm pretty sure. No, what was the deal with that?
Yeah, no, this is good. I mean, I'm loving you digging up these things that I don't normally get asked, because I love those kind of details.
Good.
And I'll tell you exactly where it came from. And sorry to disappoint all the listeners. There's nothing sexual about it. What it is one of the books that Bram referenced in the interview that he gave James Stoddard was a book about werewolves by the Reverend Sabine Baring Gould. So once again, Dacre goes out and buys the book. All these books from the London Library, I've gone and bought them. I read the thing to see exactly what was it that Bram used in his notes and then in his novel. And of course, werewolf was, I wouldn't, I would say invented. It was part of mythology and folklore, just like the living dead, the undead, the vampires were. What Bram did was he just merged them together for his convenience. He said that the vampire could change into a bat, a rat, a wolf, a dog, the mist. So he took, he's like cherry picked the best of the best, the most horrifying superstitions of the day, and he took some from Emily Gerard. He took some from Reverend Sabine Baring Gould, whose book on werewolves that he referenced. So it's like this is that the hairiness of the palms is a werewolf. But I'm glad you also asked about the other appearance, because I don't like to challenge people on a show, but here's a bit of a challenge. Go and pick up, and you can get this for free. I'm not trying to get a book from me or anybody else. You can go to Project Gutenberg online and get yourself a copy of Dracula and read the first 2 chapters. And you can see something that this is the 125th anniversary of Dracula this year. You're going to see something that's not been around for 125 years that people don't recognize. The image that Bram Stoker used when he created his persona of Dracula is not Vlad the Impaler. He used his history. And it's a little bit Henry Irving, his boss. And it's a little bit the character that Henry Irving used, Mephistopheles, the devil in the play Faust. Again, merger, lots of pieces. It's nothing like Bela Lugosi. So what's cool is we owe a lot. My family owes a lot to the Lugosi family. And I know Lynn quite well. We've been on interviews together. We talk about this. A great symbiotic relationship exists between the spirits of Bela and Bram, who say, look what we did for each other. Bram writes the book that Lugosi stars on stage and on screen. But if it wasn't for Lugosi's incredible, sort of compelling imagery of this sophisticated, debonair-looking, horrifying guy, that's all the stage would allow in England at the time. If you had put this gnarly, horrible-looking devil creature out on the stage, people would have, slammed the seats and they would have been out of there. So the first guys, Hamilton Dean and John Balderston in 1922 and 3 and 4, when they start working out how to stage Dracula, they've got to get an attractive-looking guy with a dinner jacket that is appealing on stage, not what Bram wrote. But that's what I'm saying is go look at the description of the guy. He's not an attractive guy at all. He's not Gary Oldman. He's not Christopher Lee. He's not Luke Evans. It is the horrifying guy that what Bram wanted. And what I'm trying to do, and I did in Dracula, didn't do it so much in Dracula the Undead, but to bring back the original horrifying looking Dracula in graphic novels, in RPG, on graphic game console games, that sort of thing. So a friend of mine, Chris McCauley, and I are doing this sort of stuff to bring back, especially on the 120th anniversary, the Dracula that Bram created, not the one that was created and has done very well. But that's that deal, is that imagery is a bit werewolf, a bit Strigoi, a bit Nosferatu, that kind of deal.
What was the Stoker appearance? Was it a white mustache, kind of like Sam Elliott or something?
Yeah, you're right. The white mustache was the only thing that was white. Everything else was black. No bow tie, no little medal. He had the pointy ears. He had the high forehead, the pointy teeth, obviously, aquiline nose. So yeah, it was a horrifying, looking, not very sexy, but demonic looking creature. And what I have to say is that Bram was somebody that had a belief in this emerging science at the time called phrenology. Have either of you guys ever heard of phrenology or physiognomy? Yeah, Jay.
I have not.
Bumps on the head.
Yeah. Jay's right. It's bumps on the head. It's the facial appearance will actually give us an idea of their physical, mental characteristics. So if a guy looks like a criminal, he's going to be a criminal. That's a summing it up. And so Bram actually describes Count Dracula as this criminal, evil-looking creature, and he actually has Van Helsing in the story mention, oh yes, as a physiognomist, I believe in this too. Guess what? Arthur Conan Doyle, Winston Churchill, some of Bram's other buddies in this sort of literati of the time also believed in this stuff. So it was interesting, cool, emerging sciences that were making their way into the story to suit Bram's needs.
Definitely fascinating. Go ahead, Jay, if you want to get some questions.
Yeah, Jay, go for it.
Yeah, I got to go. First of all, I want just briefly want to go back to the 26 books you mentioned that are in the library. So what you're saying is, if correct me if I'm wrong, but it sounds to me like these were the exact same books that were in Bram's office, that he physically touched these books that you went over to London and verified.
No, they weren't in his office. They were in the library. So it's a library that he was a member of. So it was a private library. He physically took those books out of the shelf. He physically sat down and read them. And the guy, bugger that he was, with a pencil wrote in the margins and then put them back on the shelf. And unlike libraries back when and I'm dating ourselves, when we were kids, they didn't have that little card in the back, with the date stamp.
Right.
They didn't have that. What they had was Bram Stoker would go to the librarian and say, I'd like to read the book by William Wilkinson. So she would write Bram Stoker, William Wilkinson, Wallachia, Moldavia. Here's your book, sir. How many do you want? Oh, I'll have 3 other while I'm at it. They'd go and get the books. He would go into a room. He would go study them. When he'd put it back, he'd go to the head person and they would check off his name, put the book back. The problem was those records were lost in a fire and also in around the time of World War II bombings of London. The good thing was the books weren't lost. So the guy who was running the library couldn't just go to the checkout, booklet. He had to go to these books because they were listed at the back of the notes for Dracula and figured, oh, they're listed here. I wonder if they're here. And sure enough, he pulled them out and saw these notes in the margins, and we could verify that it was Bram's tendency to do it that way. And that's how we figured out they were actually his.
Well, that's so cool. So if me and Jeff went to London right now, we could look at those books.
You would have. They've taken them out of general circulation, but you could go to the library and say, I'm making a request as a guest to come in and look at them. They've got them behind glass, and they've got a display of them. But the answer is yes. But they're not stupid enough to leave them on the shelf anymore so that somebody could take it out and pinch it.
I was going to say that I had to find out what was wrong, what had happened to them, because had they just left them in there, someone was going to hear this interview and jet off to London and pocket those books. So
reminds me of Red Dragon eating the book. You don't want anybody doing that.
He did eat the book. He ate the Robert Blake original painting.
Yeah. That's right.
Well, Jay, when I was there, I'll tell you my own little clandestine move, and I've admitted this in my lectures. I asked if I can take pictures with my iPhone of those pages with the marks. Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Then I went back to my hotel, went on to Abe Books, and start looking for first editions of the exact or the same edition that was in the library before this stuff became public, because I didn't want, once the news goes out, the stock in those books are going to go up. Mm-hmm. So I got 12 of the 26, the ones I really wanted, for some of them were, $100 or $200, not $1,000 each. But I accumulated, to me, the top 12 that were the most important, the real juice, and have those. And then I've taken the photographs and I've then blown it up and inserted it, the pages in there. So I now have a record of what the original, what Bram's handiwork was like in the original book.
That's so cool to see mechanically where the stories came from. But in reading some of the talking points about what you've been doing with these stories, you've written an origin story, and I'm not as familiar with the Dracula. I like Dracula, I like vampire stuff, but I don't know as much as Jeff. And as far as I know, the only Hollywood origin story is, I think, the Dracula Untold with Luke Evans. Yeah. And there's never been an attempt to say how Dracula got his power, how he got vampirism. I mean, so How did Bram find the origin of how people become vampires? I mean, because it seems like it's a combination of curse and disease, but that it seems it can be cured. Whereas werewolfism or lycanthropy, once you have it, there's no cure. It's like, unless you get killed. So is the origin story for these vampires, whether it's a disease or a curse or both, it comes from Turkey?
Okay, so
Or is that oversimplified?
no, I know you, I appreciate your attempt to simplify it, but it unfortunately can't be done because first of all, let's just talk about. I'll put Dracula aside for a moment, which is the origin story that J.D. Barker and I did. We'll just leave that aside for a moment. What we know Bram did was read all these books that were written by people that were highly respected. Emily Gerard was respected. Her and her sister had written lots of books. Reverend Sabine Baring Gould, a couple of medical doctors, other adventurers, a lawyer. These were upstanding people that were interested enough to find superstitions, mythology, religion, and all these things from Turkey, but not just Turkey. It was also Greek Orthodox, other religions that were sort of found to be existing in this part of the world between Hungary and the Black Sea. Blam called it the melting pot of religion and superstition and folklore. And there was a lot of it. It was also a very mountainous region. It's the Carpathian Mountains, or like the Alps. And with that, you get these pockets of belief systems and high superstition that go on because of isolation and so on. You've also had plagues and communicable diseases that have ravaged through Europe starting in the 1400s and so on, when people had no idea about germ theory or communicable diseases. And what happened because of that is the church would send out the most learned men of the time, which is the priests or the military medical doctors, to find out why the heck these people in strange locations are digging up graves and impaling people and stabbing them or cutting off their heads and sticking their heads in between their legs or sticking bricks in their mouths. So, Jay, this is the beginning in real history of people needing answers for why people are dying without any God-given reason. And that is because, a disease goes around, kills one person in the family, and they're all sleeping in a close little hut. And this guy dies, and nobody knows when they bury him that all the others are infected as well, but it's going to take 2 or 3 days of incubation before the next person succumbs or shows symptoms. So they believe that this guy they just put in the ground, his soul or his self is coming out of the earth and taking the life from the others because they're now succumbing. Now there's 2 dead. And so others in the family begin to succumb to tuberculosis or whatever the heck it is. And now the towns are freaking out. They go to the priest of whatever religion, say, normally you tell us, live a good life and God will take care of us. And, it's God's will. They want more answers than that. And so they decide to take matters in their own hands. And, the guy who speaks the loudest is the shaman or the spiritualist or whatever. He says, I don't care what the priest says. We're opening up this grave and we're going to keep this body in the ground so Uncle so-and-so doesn't come out and suck the life out of others. What do they find? The most craziest thing you can imagine. A bloated-looking body, bloated because of biological gas. They have blood trickling out of the mouth and out of their nose, which is the decomposition process. In some cases, it looks like the hair has grown or the fingernails have grown. Now these uneducated people who don't understand germ theory are now convinced that this bloated body with blood dripping through the shroud has just had a big meal of blood, and they've darn well better stop him from coming out of the ground again, so they stake him or cut his head off. So this is the beginning of what Bram latched into, was people believing that the vampire was a result of some sort of curse. The mourning ritual didn't go well, something that they did wrong, like incest. So there was all these reasons that were essentially what they call kind of cautionary tales.
Right.
Don't do this. You got to live a good life. Otherwise, you're going to turn into a vampire. That's the original methodology for people in the Middle Ages, through Vlad the Impaler's time, to become a vampire. In addition to that, what Jeff was asking about earlier, was Emily Gerard writes about the Cholomonts. That's what Bram latched into. Is there's a school of the dark arts up in these dark mountains where people believe that anytime there is thunder and lightning, it's the gods being pissed off at everybody, and they control the weather and they control everybody's future and so on. And so it would make sense that the devil has a school of the dark arts, and at the end he takes in 13 students, and at the end he keeps one of them as his tuition. In this case, this is how Bram's Count Dracula became a vampire. So that is what I have come to know about my famous relative's origin story. Not much, but it's just enough of a hint to say it latches into and it ties up with existing belief system of what I've just been telling you guys, as well as Emily Gerard publishing it. So what I did with J.D. Barker is, all right, yeah, we are aware that in 1992, Jim Hart wrote this origin story that had Vlad the Impaler fighting the Ottomans, and somebody shot an arrow through the window of the castle where his wife was, Ponari Castle, and said, "Your husband is dead. We're coming for you. If you give up, we'll kill you gracefully." She commits suicide. Now, of course, suicide is a mortal sin in the Christian church, and Vlad was fighting for Christianity at the time. He was a Christian. He comes back from war, and he finds his wife cannot be buried in a consecrated grave or a religious ceremony. He's pissed off that he's now risking his life and everything to fight off the Ottomans. He rebels against Christianity, stabs the cross, drinks the blood. That's how Jim Hart has him convert to a vampire. And it worked, because then the story goes, as Jeff was talking about, Vlad is now looking for his reincarnated wife, Mina, but he gets sidetracked to have a little drink of blood from Lucy along the way.
Yeah. and I kind of agree with that, because we had, like Jeff said, we had a show a few weeks ago where we talked about all things vampire, and trying to find an origin for the creature. What I looked up was that it's like you said about people, whether they dig up dead bodies or they're seeing bodies during the breakdown process, because almost all vampires in the original stories are dark, ruddy, dark gray, bloated. Yeah. They're not skinny. They're not white. They're not charismatic. So it seems like there's probably not a mythological creature that we can, because even though there's stories all over the planet of vampire type things, it doesn't seem like it's an actual cryptozoological creature, like, unicorns and right. Cyclopes and things like that. There's other stories of other weird monsters and creatures that maybe the bodies of these creatures, we don't find them because they're under the ocean. Maybe they left because they were aliens and they left on a spaceship. But that's a good explanation of how, because I didn't even think about it as people were not only not educated, they couldn't read, most of them. Yep. So a lot of people wouldn't have read the books anyways. You'd had to been really, really sharp to catch that Bram had pulled from different sources to get his vampire together. And you'd really have to be just country dumb to see a dead body and go, "Ooh, he just walked around the earth and drank a bunch of blood."
Right. And you know what's interesting as well, and I just went on and on about the Middle Ages. In Bram's notes, he actually had an article that he clipped out of a newspaper in 1896 in New York, from the New York World newspaper, that was talking about a vampire scare in New England at that same time, the end of the 1800s. And it was attributed to exactly the same thing their distant relatives would have dealt with in Eastern Europe and throughout Europe, communicable disease. What was going on in New England was tuberculosis. Mm-hmm. And that if you look at, and I know many doctors have looked at it, and they say, well, that's the classic disease to make people really believe, even with a slightly more educated mind at the end of the 1800s, that there was potentially vampires going on. And we're not just talking one or two cases here. There was 50 state approved exhumations, Mercy Brown being one, Sarah Tillinghast being the other, in the New England states, where people were absolutely believing that they needed to dig up the body, either take out the heart, burn it at a crossroads, bring back the ashes, feed it to those other family members or people in the community that they felt were being affected by vampire, to kind of inoculate them against it, or stake it through the heart, sort of thing. And Bram took that article and used parts of it in the story, because the second half of the article, the writer was pretty savvy. Not only was he talking about the vampire scare attributed to TB, but he also mentioned Charles Darwin, who published in 1859, not too long before The Origin of the Species, that rocked the heck out of the scientific world as far as the origin of species goes.
Right.
He mentioned the vampire bat that he discovered in South America. And so what does Bram do? He uses those same words in Quincy Morris when Van Helsing is trying to explain to the band of heroes, yes, these vampire bats, when I was down in South America, the vampire bats came out of the trees, drank so much blood from my famous mare, I had to put her down. So there is no question that Bram hit pay dirt with this article. He used words from in Quincy's mouth, but he also realized, oh my gosh, if these people in 1896 believe in vampires, they're going to love my book. It's like this is going to make them feel like it's written in real time. We know the story was actually set in 1893, even though Bram wrote it between 1890 and 1897. So it's a real time story.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and interesting you mentioned the tuberculosis thing, because they had the bubonic plague and other just communicable diseases. People thought that water was the main source for some of these diseases, so they didn't bathe. And had they not done the other way, bubonic plague might not have killed half the planet. But there's an interesting tie-in in Star Trek: The Next Generation. It's a 2-part episode where you've got cholera and like these space vampires who went back in time, who are snatching people's soul energy out of their bodies and using it for food for their people back in the 23rd century. So you got these guys, the typical miner, 49er miner, who's coughing up blood in the street. Yeah. And that might be the same thing. The person sees this guy dead with blood coming out of his mouth. Oh, there's a dead vampire. Yeah. But in actuality, the vampire was the unseen snake alien space dude who killed him and went back into the future with his energy. So, I don't know if you've seen the episode, but it's a very cool episode.
No, I'm going to need to, because and this is, you didn't plant this. We didn't say this, but Bram Stoker's mother, Charlotte, survived the famous cholera epidemic in Sligo, Ireland, in 1832, where they lost half the town. She wrote a story, an account of the cholera epidemic, misdiagnosis and premature burial of people she knew, and sent it to Bram at his request. Bram used that story. It's in the Stoker archives in Trinity College. Bram used that story as a basis for a children's story. One of the first books Bram wrote was called Under the Sunset, and it was horror stories for children. That's typical Irish. but it's all about this, called The Invisible Giant. And it's all about they're not knowing what this cholera epidemic was. And the lore that I understand within my family is that she told Bram this story while he was infirmed, for 7 years. They had to keep the kid educated, interested, aware of stuff. He was told all kinds of cool stories of Irish folklore and mythology, but she told him the cholera story, And then years later, when she moved to France with Bram's two sisters so they could be trained in the arts, the fine arts, he asked her to type up that story and send it to him, which now exists in the Trinity College archives, its history. So there's a good tie-in of collar as well as premature burial and people dragging themselves out of the grave when they were buried prematurely.
Yeah, we talked about that too. On the side, there's a little private chat screen. I typed in the Star Trek Next Generation episode Times Arrow Parts 1 and 2. I don't remember which season it is, but if you look those two episodes up, it's a really, really good show. And there's a guy, I can't remember the actor's name, that plays a spot on Samuel Clemens, Mark Twain.
Cool.
He's dead on Mark Twain. And he's a great character throughout the show. So check it out, definitely. Now, one thing I definitely wanted to talk to you about, and we brought up quite a few things that I've already written notes on, and we talked about the origin of how Vlad Dracula became Dracula, but there are several different ways to become a vampire. So you mentioned one, he drinks in that movie, Jim Hart, you said? He drinks blood. In the Lost Boys, they make a person a vampire by having them drink blood. And that's kind of a new one on me. I saw it first with the Lost Boys, and I thought that's an interesting twist. And I think Bram came up with this one. You have to be bitten 3 times before you become a vampire. So you got those methods there, but how did the vampire become the vampire first? It's something, I mean, there's got to be a beginning for where the vampire comes from, and then being bitten, drinking the blood, et cetera, forward.
Yeah, no, that's what you're touching on is probably one of the most common things that us vampire writers do when you sit around a bar at a convention after you've been at the panels and tables, and now you're just, okay, guys, in your universe, in your world, how's your vampire created? How's your vampire created? And who did
it's like
this?
a chicken before the egg kind of conversation, I'd imagine.
It is, but okay, so the pure answer is I don't know, because it is obviously a mythology that exists all over the world. Bram mentioned 13 countries in this Jane Starr interview, and who knows for sure is one better than the other, because it's all in some people's minds about communicable diseases, what it is, what disfigurement you may have become a vampire. Who the heck knows? But the point is, you got cool movies like one of you guys mentioned the Luke Evans movie Untold. I think that was very cool. You've got this guy who says, I need to be powerful, all powerful, to protect my people against this huge force, the Ottoman Empire. I'm going to take one for the team, and I'm going to crawl up this mountainside and go visit this horrible, gnarly guy and go through this ritual and get converted, and that's it. That's a cool conversion story. Then you've got things like Bram Stoker, who's got Mina, who gets bitten one time and she drinks blood. Lucy has to get drained of blood a few times. And so as she gets drained, we never know if Lucy ever drinks any of Count Dracula's blood. All we know is that she got drained and she was being refilled or topped up by, the mortal guys, but obviously wasn't doing the trick, and she eventually succumbed. But we don't know if when she succumbed, did she actually have to get vampire blood to turn her? So I in a funny way, Jay, I think Bram Stoker, because he was such a realist and set his story in such realistic terms, I think he purposely did not include the definitive way in his universe to create conversion from mortal to immortal. I think he wanted to leave it nebulous so people couldn't call him on it, because he had so much actual medicine in the story that even in the days, somebody like one of his brothers, my great granduncle being one of the doctors, and then Thornley was one, and there was even one more, they could have sat him down and said, no, there's no way that could work. And look, back in the day, they didn't even know about blood typing. They did blood transfusions, out of thin air. It wasn't too long before 1890, when this story was starting to be written, that they were doing blood transfusions from pigs and dogs into people.
Yeah.
So, I hate to be a guy that's shirking the question, I don't think there's a definitive answer anywhere, because there's nobody that actually was ground zero. If you look at John Polidori's book, The Vampire, you look at Carmilla, you look at Varney the Vampire, they all came before Bram. Would they be the ones you look at and say they've got the definitive right to say this is how the vampire is formed? Bram Stoker, does he have the right to say no? It's his way, because I think they all recognize that it's in myth, and in myth we've got some wiggle room.
Yeah, and there's what they call retconning in like Hollywood. There's a lot of weird things that happen in almost any TV show that they come up on a conundrum like, well, how did this happen if that happened? And they go back and say, oh, well, this happened in the years past. We didn't talk about it. So that's something what he thought about is, I don't have to do the origin story. Somewhere down the road, someone's going to do it for me. And then we can go, oh, well, this is how it happened before Dracula became Dracula. This is how he got those powers. So that's interesting. And there are so many different stories of the vampire. I don't like all of them, to be honest with you. I cringe at those shiny vampires, the ones with Robert Pattinson in them. I don't know if you've watched those, but it's kind of creepy. I don't really care for that kind of love story between vampires and werewolves. Some of the underworld stuff where there's vampires versus werewolves is kind of okay, but it seems to me, and you talked about this earlier in the show, and I've played Dungeons and Dragons throughout my entire college career. Vampires are a big monster in that game world. And they have power over wolves. They can create, they can change into wolves and cats and bats and cloud of mist. But they can also summon hundreds of rats, tens or thousands of rats, hundreds of bats, 1 or 2 to 7 werewolves or wolves, and they can also control. So it would seem to me in the underworld universe where they get vampire versus werewolf, the vampire would go, "Hey, you stop, heal, and end of story."
But that would make that wouldn't make for what? How many episodes? How many different shows?
5 or
movies
6
are
of them, yeah.
And we wouldn't get to see Kate Beckinsale in that pretty cool outfit. That would be a shame. And that skin tight thing, that was I had to say.
The eye candy aspect is probably why those movies moved forward.
I would think so.
And the same with the Mila Jovovich movies that she did, like the zombie stuff in. She's a beautiful lady, but I think she's a horrible actress. And the movie she did with the zombies is just gut wrenching.
And I know there were some things that I wanted to ask about. I know there's a story about you going to Transylvania and you had an emergency situation. How many times have you been to Transylvania?
Well, Jeffrey, sorry. First thing is,
okay.
You're going to have to come with me someday. I go on a fairly regular basis. I think I've now been there 10 or 11 times. I started going on research. I've been there now leading tours. I've been invited by the government to sometimes to help them understand how to do proper tourism related to vampires and not make it cheesy and so on. Been over there to be guests at festivals. Right now I'm working with a company called Experience Transylvania. 2 sisters, both of them from the city of Sibiu in Transylvania. And one of them is married a Swedish guy. She lives in Stockholm, and they run the company from there. But we do take tours of, 8, 10, 12, 15, 20 people and bring them to places associated with both Vlad the Impaler, so the Vlad history, and then the Count Dracula history and where they merge together. So I'm pretty knowledgeable of the place, and I've made a really good effort so that I can understand what Bram Stoker knew, having never gone there, but I can also understand the issues that people talk about when they go, "Oh God, it's your famous relative that turned our national hero into a Hollywood icon." Please. I say, no, not really. It's not only us, but it's all the movies, all the stage plays, and so on. But when they see that what I'm trying to do is set the record straight. And kind of like I did again, top of the show. Where did Bram get the information about Vlad? Who was Vlad? What castles did Vlad actually stay in? It was Ponari Castle and Targoviste, and born in Sigishwara. Let's go there and see his story. Has nothing to do with Vlad at Dracula, But let's go to those places as well. They're a couple hundred miles apart. But answering your question, Jeff, about my somewhat emergency situation, I'll try to give you the Reader's Digest version because this thing could go on. But here's what happened. In about 2015 or 16, a buddy of mine, again a researcher, was looking through Bram Stoker's notes. His name was Hans de Roos, and noticed that right in front of all of us who've been looking at this stuff since the 60s, not me, for instance, but I've been looking at it for 10 years, and I didn't notice these two numerical markings in the page, along with some names of rivers and mountains. It turns out when this guy looked into it, that this was two lines of longitude and latitude. He's got long and lat. We should have known, but they were pointed to a location in the Saudi Arabian desert. So he contacted me and said, I think I found where Bram was trying to end his novel. Because in the end of the novel, when the band of heroes are closing in on Count Dracula, as the gypsies are bringing him in his litter wagon back to his castle Dracula, he mentions they must have crossed here at the 47th parallel, where the river Sereth flows into Bistritza. Okay, that's in the notes. It's also in the damn map, one of the maps in these books in the London Library. And when you invert the lines of longitude and latitude that Bram put into his notebook, bingo, it puts us right here in the Borgo Pass, right next to the river Sereth and Bistritza, where they merge together. And bingo, it's right at an extinct volcano called Mount Israel that is written in his notes. What's significant about that? In these books in the London Library, they talk about volcanoes being the portals to hell and the home of the devil, where the dark arts reign. So now we find where Bram was thinking of the home of Count Dracula is got to be a volcano. What happens when I go to Seattle to look at the actual Dracula typescript, when J.D. Barker and I were doing our research for Dracula, we find that there was an original ending of the novel that was edited out, literally crossed out with marks, pen marks. What was significant about it? Right after the stake went into Dracula's heart and he crumbled into dust and his throat was slit, a volcano erupted. So there's no question that Bram Stoker, as detail-oriented as he was, would have had his ending on a volcanic mountain if he was planning to have a volcanic eruption. And sure enough, his lines of longitude and latitude point towards an extinct volcano. So guess what? I got to go there. I've got, all the castles that I've been to, and de Roos has been to also in Romania in search of Castle Dracula and the connection between Vlad and the Count. Now we know where Bram was planning to end the story and the home of the fictional Castle Dracula. So I convinced my son, Parker, who's a PhD student, to join me on one of my tours. It's an 8-day tour, just as I described. And when the tour is over, we stay for 3 more days. And a friend of mine is going to drive us from Bucharest all the way up into the top of the country to where the Borgo Pass is, right next to the Transylvania-Moldavian border, next to Bukovina, just as Bram described in the novel. And sure enough, this guide that I hired, and I gave him the lines of longitude and latitude, he plugged it into his GPS and did his conversion. And along with 3 of my other buddies from there, I felt that there was a need to go a little bit strength in numbers because I was a little scared of what we're going to get into.
And it's true, he's there.
Well, guys, it gets eerie. Let me just tell you. So we all converge at this bed and breakfast up in the mountains, much like Jonathan Harker converging with his other fellow travelers in Bistritz before he takes the carriage to the Borgo Pass. We head into this bed and breakfast. We got our backpacks for the next day. We got our rain gear, and we've got a guide from the area who used to be a high mountain weatherman who gives us the bad news. Tomorrow the weather's going to suck. We're going to have clouds, low clouds. We're going to have some drizzle. We may even have some storms. Do you still want to go? And the answer was, yes, we got to go. There's no question. This is our only day to do it. We got a flight in 2 days. We got to do it tomorrow, then take a day to get back to Bucharest. So we head off, and we essentially don't, there's no regular trail. We're bushwhacking through dense forest, clear cuts where there's these stobs. You know, if you've ever walked through a mountain where they've cut the trees down, you've got these sharp spikes in the grounds where they've cut them off. So it's a little bit dangerous as we traverse and go up the mountainside, up to 6,000 feet. We have 3 hours of kind of treacherous walking, but not particularly no ropes and rocks and that kind of thing. But we do get above the tree line. We get up on top, and we see a very obvious, very huge caldera, the cone. And it's not the bottomless pit. It's obviously filled in with stuff. And there happens to be a sulfur mine down there, which is very cool. So that's good. We take our photos, we have a bite to eat, and we decide, you know what? We shouldn't go back down the way we just came up, because as our guide said, and I'm an outdoorsman, I've been hiking all my life and stuff, more accidents happen going down a slippery slope, especially with spikes, than they do going up. We really should go another way down. It could be dangerous. And with that, we have thunder in the distance. And the guide says, well, let's look at the map. We can go around the cone, and there's a road. And it might take us a couple hours to get there, but it'll be much safer. And we all say, yeah, that makes sense. The downside is we're up on top of these mountain ledges, and the storms are starting to roll in. We hear thunder. We see lightning way far away. But we got a couple hours head start, and we get to this road 5 hours later. So we've been now 8 hours on this trek. It's hard going. The visibility is next to nothing. And we have a decision to make. We think we can make it down, and we look at the map and we kind of extrapolate. We think it's about 10 miles walking down this road. And again, we're second guessing, God, maybe we should have taken our chances on getting impaled on the way down. But instead we say, you know what? We're going up, because our guide, being a former high mountain weatherman, he says, there's a weather station up here. We can seek refuge in there if we need to. We can spend the night. It won't be the most comfortable thing, but at least we're not in electrical storms and so on. And I'm looking at my son going, my God, if there's not a Jonathan Harker moment, buddy, this is it. And we're going to be okay. And we get to this mountain weather station, and the guy comes out, this young guy, and he gives our guide an endless amount of grief. What the heck are you doing? This is you're so stupid to be putting these guys at risk. There's electricity in the air. Get in here. We don't have any blankets for you guys. Take off your wet clothes and stand by the heater. It's your lucky day, because I got a friend who's coming up sometime in the next hour or so bringing me supplies. Maybe he can help you out. So right out of the movies, in about 30 minutes, these two gnarly guys get out of like a Romanian 1950s Ford Bronco and pull out polinka. They pull out bread, smoked fat, and cheese, and all this Romanian going back and forth saying, can you help these guys? And I'm like gathering all of our Romanian money called lei. We can bribe them, whatever it takes. Let's just get the heck out of here. And he goes, oh, I will save you guys. But first we drink, which is typical Eastern European. But first we drink. So he lays out the food, the smoked fat, the pork, the cheese, the bread, and pours this stuff. And I'm sorry if there's any Romanians listening. Polinka is this plum brandy, like 110 proof. It's like nails going down your throat. Brutal stuff. But it's also very rude to not drink it when it's put in front of you, especially if he's going to rescue your butt.
Yeah.
So we're all here. Now, to make life more interesting, the guide and one of my buddies who's got the two cars, they simply do putting the liquor next to their lips. That's okay if you're a driver, because they've got really strict driving rules there. 1 DUI, no driving for the rest of your life.
Wow.
So it's like a little touch to the lips. And then they pass it to me or my son. We got to drink because we're not driving and we don't want to be rude. The stuff is horrible, but me and my son are getting hammered now for the next half an hour as all these toasts are going on. And the guide finally tells the rescuer, oh, but this is the great grandnephew and great great grandnephew of Bram Stoker. We've discovered the fictional home of Castle Dracula. More Palinka starts to flow, and the guy begins to tell us, you guys, where did you come from? We said, from America. No, you fools. Where did you come from today? Oh, this bed and breakfast over here. And this is all translated. So we're getting it softened from our guide. He said, if you had only stayed at my bed and breakfast, you would have had an easy 4-hour walk up a gentle trail to this location. Instead, we made it really tough on ourselves, and we did get up there. But the story is great. He did drive us down. My son and I would just have to say, our stomachs weren't resting easy that day, because bouncing all the way down the back of this Romanian Ford Bronco. And on the way down, I was a little loopy. So I said, and what about the sulfur mine that we saw over there? Oh, you want to see the sulfur mine, he says in Romania. Yeah, let's go there, because it just happened that the other guy in the vehicle with him was a retired sulfur miner from this mine that was shut down in 92. But the coolest thing, guys, was revealed. I said, in Dracula, there's this folklore of there's blue flames that Jonathan Harker sees in the Borgo Pass when he's in the carriage. Is there any chance that the sulfur it has something to do with this legend of the blue flame? Because just before this trip, I'd seen a CNN special on mining in Chile of sulfur and how horrific it was. There was no respirators for the miners. They would be like bandanas over their faces. They're sucking in this sulfurous gas, and spontaneous combustion of these rocks. And guess what? The flame was blue. Mm-hmm. So I was wondering if there's any connection. And he goes, but of course, we get lightning strikes all the time, just like in these storms right here. And when they hit the ground and burn a tree and they ignite the rocks, they burn blue. And I go, oh, yeah, that's got to be where the whole idea of the blue flame leads to buried treasure. I said, well, what's the treasure? We said, you idiot, it's the sulfur. The sulfur is the treasure. That's what people in those days were using for gunpowder. Mm-hmm. Gunpowder was like the most important natural resource, because he who has the gunpowder has the bombs. So this was fortuitous that we were rescued by a guy that not only knew about the blue flame, we had a sulfur miner, but now he invites us to go to his bed and breakfast the next day before we head back to get our plane, and invites the head of the national park to come with us. More Palinka is served. And I'm saying, guys, I will put up a plaque designating this as Bram Stoker's home of the fictional Castle Dracula if you will designate a trail from multiple directions, the easy ones as well as the hard ones.
Hey guys, real quick, I'm going to run and unplug the RV. It's pouring rain and there's a cord. So Jay, ask a few questions. I'll be super fast. I better do it.
So to finish this off is, yeah, I mean, this was cool, the rescue and everything else. I do go back 2 years later and I bring back a plaque. It's lots of news spread all over the place. Massive news outlets come here to see this. And I feel, Jay, I feel good that I'm contributing to, Dracula tourism in Romania to set the record straight with the help of Hans de Roos, who found this coordinates. And now we can direct tourists not just to go to Castle Bran in Brasov, which is the castle Bram saw the outside of in a book, 2 pictures actually, and what he described as the outside, but he placed it 400 miles to the northeast where the volcano was. So that's the, somewhat short version of a long ass story of how we had a Jonathan Harker experience, how we found the place, and now how I can proudly say, as a family member, I'm contributing positively to responsible vampire tourism in Romania.
Yeah, that's really cool. That would be awesome to be a part of that. I have sort of an off-subject story about sulfur. my friends and I, when we were kids, we somehow got our hands on the anarchist cookbook recipe for gunpowder. So 10-year-old idiots we were, we took our bikes up to the giant grocery store. We bought what we could there, charcoal, and I think we bought a bunch of first strike box matches, the kind you can strike on your jeans or on your zipper.
Yeah, on the zipper, yeah.
For this, because we weren't sure if we could find sulfur. Then we went down into Potomac, Maryland, to the hardware store, where we actually found actual rock sulfur and saltpeter, sodium nitrate. And so we got all the three main ingredients: charcoal, nitrate, and sulfur. But being idiots and kids, we messed up the formula. We made gunpowder. It just wasn't black gunpowder. And what happened was we used too much sulfur. So when we tested it, we had like a cutting board and we lit it, and it kind of danced around in this like yellow hot ball of flaming gas. And we're like, okay, it works. So back then, this was the 70s, late 70s, almost early 80s. Back then, Coca-Cola came in little 16-ounce bottles, or Pepsi. I think it was a Pepsi bottle. So one of those short, fat glass bottles with a screw-on lid.
Yeah.
So we threw the lid away. We took a cork. We drilled a hole in it. You could take this one long wick off of firecrackers that would light up the whole string. So we took that wick off. We put that through the cork. We took our mixture of yellow yuck and gunpowder stuff and put it in the bottom of the bottle, corked it with the wick going into the mixture.
Oh, geez.
And as idiots, that's exactly where it's going. We handed it to the youngest of us, and we lit it, and we said, go put it on that porch over there. So he runs over. He's like 6. We're all the rest are like 8 and 9 and 10. He puts the Coke bottle down on this portico front porch. So it's like a door with like an extra portal around it. And we're waiting. We're looking at our watch. We're going, it's a dud. We messed up somewhere. Nothing's going to happen. So we sent the same little kid back. Go get it.
Oh, no.
10, 15 feet from the bottle, it explodes.
Oh.
And he goes flying backwards, all 4 limbs like in the air, like he got knocked off a horse by a joust. He gets shot backwards about 8 or 9 feet. All the windows on the front and the side and back of the house in the first level shattered. And we're like, we're all like 8, 9, 10 the oldest. We look at each other and go, and like
Run.
rats, even disappear through the woods and back into our homes. We all got caught. Don't get me wrong, but and we all had to pay for those windows. But had we done that today, we'd all be homeland terrorists.
And nothing. No, the 6-year-old didn't get glass shrapnel all through his body, or
no, he just knocked out. He was unconscious on the floor. We left him there. We're like, see you later. We're going. His brother, the house we did in was him and his brother's house. We made the mixture in their garage. The house we blew up was the one next door. My house was luckily a couple streets away, so we just ran through the houses, through the trees behind the neighborhood to our house and tried to hide to no avail. But it was fun. But wow, was that stupid?
Yeah. Wow. That's bizarre. Well, luckily, like that, nothing happened bad to us. One of the thing that the miner did when we went to the sulfur mine, which is a massive open pit mine, he took out a hammer from the vehicle and just sort of wandered around as we were going down into it. And he picked up a rock and smashed it with the hammer, and sort of split it open as if you're looking for like geodes or something. Mm-hmm. And there was a piece of sulfur. They took out a Bic lighter and just ignited it, and it just burned a blue flame. It was so cool. Under those circumstances, we were wet, we were cold. I was a little drunk. We wanted to get back to the car, but to be able to say, here I am in freaking Transylvania, storm Harker-esque experience, and I got this sulfur miner showing me the origin of the blue flame that worked its way into folklore that my great-granduncle put into Dracula. That was so cool.
That is really cool to find those kinds of origins and like key things to the book was written 125 years ago.
Yeah.
So that's fantastic research. So the one of the things that we'd asked about in the last show on vampires is some of the powers. How many of those powers? A lot of it, I'm pretty sure it's Hollywood, but in the original book, what powers does Bram give him? Can he turn into a cloud of gas? Is he summoning rats and bats and things like that? Or and then there's other things where he can't see his mirror. How much of the vampire folklore powers are Bram Stoker, and how many are Hollywood?
Good question. And again, for you two guys who are obviously into this, and any of your listeners, try to find a copy of Bram Stoker's Notes for Dracula, because it's listed in there what he extracted from Emily Gerard. There's 3 key pages where he actually mentions things like power over rats, no reflection in a mirror, control over the weather, the mesmerism thing.
Mm-hmm.
He doesn't strength of 10 men.
Yeah.
So, okay, I don't know if I'll get them all, but remember this: when Dracula was on the Demeter, he could control the weather. Okay, he had a cloud to conceal him on the ship as it was coming to Whitby, so they could come in. There was a hell of a storm that blew the ship into the harbor, and it was such a precise storm because Bram stayed in this town for 2.5, 3 weeks and got all the storm stuff right. But he had to have the storm come in because, remember, the Count had killed all the people had jumped overboard. The captain lashed himself to the steering wheel. Dracula still needed to arrive into the safe harbor, so he had to control the weather. So that's one big thing he did. He could turn himself into mist to get underneath doors and in through windows. But he still needed to be invited in the first time. Invited in once gives you a free pass. Control over wolves. Remember, in Dracula, he controls the wolves escaping from the London Zoo. He can turn into a dog because, again, in Whitby, instead of jumping off the ship, the Demeter, as a wolf or flies away at a bat in the middle of the day, he jumps off as a black dog, which coincides to the Yorkshire myth of the Bagasht, the black dog that is the bearer of bad news, brings bad omens. What else? He can turn into the bat, because obviously he does that in the novel quite often. And then there's the mind control. If there is a blood connection, like he had with Mina, and Mina tries to read his mind, which he does to figure out where he is going as he's trying to escape, the Count can do the same to Mina. Mm-hmm. So it's kind of like that Lord of the Rings deal. If you put the ring on, you can be invisible, but you expose yourself to
the bad guy can see you. Yeah,
exactly. So that sort of thing's going on. What else? I think those are the big ones, Jay, that jump out at me. But they're all listed. Bram's got 3 pages of traits. Not all of them he uses. Yeah. Oh, I know one. You got to take your native soil with you. Okay, so only sleep in native soil. But you can only you can travel over moving water at slack tide, which is interesting. It's an ocean thing.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that, because that is kind of interesting. I think the way I think they did it in Hollywood was that he was asleep and Renfield takes his casket across the moving water. Yeah. I think if I remember correctly, one of the first movies, his castle is surrounded by either a moat or a river, and he can't cross it on his own. I think there's a scene where he chases someone to the river and they get across it. So it might even be a woman on a white horse. I don't know.
Right.
But he can't cross. He goes back to the castle. He's all defeated. But when he goes to England, Renfield, he's asleep, takes the casket, goes across the river, and of course it's filled with his dirt, and he makes it to England. So that's just, where does that come from? That just is the oddest thing. And like I said, I played Dungeons and Dragons a lot through college. It's not just vampires. There are other undead who cannot cross moving water, like not necessarily wights and shadows, but like liches are very vampire-like. They can't cross, I guess, purifying areas. That must be what it is.
I don't know. I know that it was in the Emily Gerard book. I don't know. Obviously that's not the actual, the origin. That's a source where he got the info from. Where did it come from in mythology? You're right. It could be that whole cleansing area that when the tide comes in and it goes back out, it brings new life in. It brings food in for new life. Good question. But I will tell you this, that she made a direct reference to very complex mourning rituals, that go on for a year. Somebody dies in the family. It's not, okay, a week and you sit with the body and you do some flowers and you eat some food. There are things you do periodically over the course of a year.
Mhm.
And if you don't do that, you're subject to that body, that undead creature coming out and having revenge on you as a vampire. So it's obviously a cautionary tale. It's a control issue, to say, hey, look, your husband dies. Don't go, jump in bed with the next guy, 3 weeks later. You got a whole year of this crap to go through, which is a control element, like a lot of religion is. So I think that's where the origin, Jay, where it comes from. I don't exactly know specific details on how it came to be.
Yeah, it would be interesting to find out where that comes from, because, like I said, there are other certain undead creatures that affects. I mean, and it's just like you said, cautionary tales. There's, I don't know where this one came from, but it's an English one. Don't sit around in toadstool rings. I don't know what that means. Don't go into this section of the woods at this certain time of the year or day or month or week. The boogeyman will get you. Yep. And you tell children this, what are they going to do? They're going into those woods. They're going to sit in that toadstool ring. They're going to find out what you're telling them. You tell them to go ahead and do that, and what the consequences are, they're not going to do it. But you tell them not to do something, and it's in there. So, maybe that's what the water is about. Is like, don't cross the water. The vampire will get you. I mean, I don't know. It's a weird thing.
It's folklore and superstition and stuff. Man, it is coming down out there. I got drowned, but luckily I unplugged the RV.
Your shirt's a little darker. You must
have
soaked.
I got soaked. And but definitely one thing I definitely wanted to ask you about, was it Scream magazine the Nosferatu article? I want to get that soon, so I have it in my collection. But you wrote that with who? You say your son?
Yeah, Jeff, thank you for bringing that up. I'm very proud of that one. But the recent edition, that just came out at the end of April, Scream magazine, they're doing a big feature. This is the 100th anniversary of Nosferatu, as well as the 120th anniversary of Dracula. Ooh. And my son, who has been on a trip with me, who does a lot of editing of my work, he's doing a PhD at University of South Carolina. All he's got is his dissertation left, so he's my number. Yeah.
Yahoo! Where my brother went.
Oh, cool. So he's been very helpful, and I said, look, Parker, it's time that we do something together and learn some of the family history. And again, I know we're getting close to the end here. I'll keep this short, but so many people have said, oh, that Florence Stoker, she sued Piranha Films because it was, an unauthorized adaptation of Bram Stoker's Dracula's novel, which it was. And Piranha Films admitted that it was. They just chose never to ask her for a license, for it. But it's also, in my research with the help of a guy from a film historian in Germany, it was different time. It was at the beginning of film. This is 1922, when there wasn't much film going on. And these German guys, were really into the occult, really into art and expressionism. I don't know if they gave a rat's ass about, I say that rat's ass because that's Nosferatu now. The rats were the main part of the story, and Orlok looked like a rat. If they cared about copyright infringement, but they certainly got called on it when Florence Stoker had to badger the Incorporated Society of Authors to represent her in a 2.5-year litigation, which she prevailed. And the German courts ruled in her favor that these guys basically pirated, the book and turned it into a movie. Now, since they declared bankruptcy, though, with this decision, there was no restitution to be paid to Mrs. Stoker. So, and Bram had died, 10 years earlier. So she certainly could have used the money. But what happened was the court ordered the films to be destroyed because there was no other way to have restitution. What's interesting is the films had already been sent around to different countries for previews. So the cat was already out of the bag. And the Incorporated Society of Authors, whose letters I have seen at the British Museum, and Parker and I studied them and realized that they had to tell Mrs. Stoker they have just won one court case, but they've got films in 6 different countries, and the law would be we're going to have to go to 6 different countries and run the same type of lawsuit to get the rest of those films destroyed. They said, we can't do it. We've already wasted all this money of 2.5 years for nothing, and now we can't even have the films destroyed. So it's different times, different stuff going on. I'm giving you a real short version of this article we wrote. But what really burned my butt was that while Mrs. Stoker was trying to do the right thing and trying to get her husband's book and the intellectual property of the book turned into a stage play, which she did in 1924 with Hamilton Dean and John Balderston. Remember, Nosferatu came out in 1922. It was slowed down for a while, but then it resurged, and a copy showed up in America. It showed up the same time that the stage play was doing great, and now Universal Films was looking at buying the film rights to the stage play, which they eventually did, and that was the Todd Browning 1931 version with Bela Lugosi. But Mrs. Stoker was really upset that a pirated version of Nosferatu was being shown around America, and she felt that this would stop Universal from, why should we buy and give money to you for the stage right if this pirated version is floating around? This has already tainted the market. Mm-hmm. Or maybe, well, we'll just go and make our own and not have to pay you because nothing happened the first time round. So I don't know what Universal said, but I do know that they eventually bought the one copy of Nosferatu that was floating around the U.S. to get it out of the marketplace and potentially to maybe study it and look at it and see what they can learn from it to make their version, which they did in 31. And incidentally, you guys probably know this, but the Spanish version was filmed on the same sets, but in the evenings after the American crew was finished filming that day, and Carlos Valleras was playing the Spanish Dracula, and many people believe David Scull, being a famous film guy, and his claims that in his book Hollywood Gothic, that the Spanish version is much more sophisticated in its camera angles and its technical knowledge of shooting a film than the Todd Browning 1931 of Lugosi. But that's sort of the short version of what Parker and I came up with, and it's it's a lot longer than that, but it's what Mrs. Stoker had to go through to pursue the court case, and then once she won, but she couldn't sort of consummate the deal with the film, and then how it almost stopped her from making good money, which she eventually made good money when they did sell the rights to Universal for that the Bela Lugosi film.
It's definitely fascinating.
I got a quick, sort of, again, off the market tie-in. When I came home today after the grocery store, you mentioned your son goes to the University of South Carolina. Their mascots, the Gamecocks. My neighbor was having a birthday party for his 5 or 6 year old kid, and one of their friends was parked in my parking space. But his back license plate cover was the United States USC Gamecocks on it. I'm like, oh, woohoo! I almost took a picture to send to my brother. And then you mentioned that, but you also mentioned like the history of Hollywood, which I know a little bit about. I didn't know that about the Spanish American version, how they flip flopped on the sets. What I can say is it's neat that Universal bought the competition. That's Hollywood, what they would have been like 50 years, 60 years ago. Yeah. What I also found interesting is the movie. I don't know if you've ever seen this. You might want to take a look at it. It is horrible. It's just so bad. It's so old. But The Man in the Moon. It's H.G. Wells' book. They did The Man in the Moon. It's like they take this giant gun. They put these guys in a bullet and they shoot them onto the moon. And the moon is a dude with like whipped cream on his face to look like the moon. It's really what it looks like. And then the bullet hits him in the eye. And he goes, "Ah!" It's one of the worst films ever because of its age. But if you watch this, it's one of the first science fiction movies ever. It's got some of the things that we still have today in movies. And this is like within the first year or 2 or 3 of motion pictures. It's got dissolves in it. It's got wipes. It's got special effects. It's got, well, you can't tell if it's horrible acting or not, but it's all silent. But there's some definite overacting stage actors because they had to come from stage to the movies. And you can tell they're overactors because they have to, because there's no sound. So in order for them to emulate to you, the audience, what they're doing, it's all over exaggerated and, in your face. But you'll find in this movie some of the same stuff you'll find in the Avengers Endgame. You won't find computer graphics, but elements of movies we still have today you find from 100 years ago.
Wow, that's cool. I've written it down. I'll think of you. I'll go check it out. Absolutely. Yeah. I like that.
Like
I love that kind of trivia, cool stuff to look at that.
Yeah, it is cool.
And I know what's going on the 125th anniversary. There's the events happening. When is that happening?
Well, the actual date, May 26, 1897, was the actual publishing date of Dracula, and so it's coming up, pretty soon. I am, a number of things are going on. It's usually May 26th. Also, it's called World Dracula Day. I didn't invent that; other people have done that. I'm going to be leading a small group of people. We tried to put a larger group together, but with unknown about COVID travel and so on. I've got 5 people and a buddy of mine who's a cameraman. We're flying over to Manchester, England. We're driving to a lovely town of York where we're having lunch, and then we're going to Robin Hood's Bay, which is near Whitby, where Bram set part of the story. Lucy and Mina and her mother went to have tea at the Bay Hotel. Bram and Florence and their son went to the Bay Hotel. So we're going to do that. And then the town of Whitby, I'm having a celebratory dinner there. That's where Bram spent his 3-week holiday in 1890. That's where he set chapter 6, 7, and 8. That's where everything changed for Bram. So we're going there. I'm giving a big audiovisual presentation at Albert's Eatery, which is a restaurant. 35 people in there. That's as many as they can fit. And then we're doing a nighttime walk to kind of mirror what Mina had to do to go and try to save Lucy across town from East Cliff West Cliff to East Cliff. And then we'll do a daytime tour around the place, look at all the sites that are mentioned in the book. And then we take off on a train and head up to Edinburgh, Scotland, where Bram and Henry Irving actually showed up to do their plays. And I'm giving a presentation at a bookstore there that I've always done well at, because I've also published a book called Slane's Castle with a buddy of mine called Mike Shepard, actual true fiction. I say true fiction, it's historical-based fiction about Slane's Castle. And that's important because the next place we go is Cruden Bay, Scotland, which is 3 hours away, where Bram actually spent 13 summer holidays and where he actually wrote Dracula. And that castle that we did a book about is the actual castle that Bram Stoker modeled the interior of his castle Dracula after. It's so interesting because he went inside that castle to visit the Earl of Errol, and it has a description in the novel that Jonathan Harker walked into Castle Dracula through a certain door, through a hall, into an octagonal room lit by a single lamp, into another room where he spent the night. That is exactly the same layout as this castle. So if you can imagine, as I said at an hour and 40 minutes ago, Bram was into merging his characters to make his Count Dracula. He did the same with his castles. A little bit of the exterior of Bran Castle in Brasov, the interior of Slane's Castle, put it together and shoved it on top of a volcano in Transylvania. That's how it all came to be. So we're going to be in that town on May 26th. There's actually a big civic reception. And much like I did on the top of Mount Israel, I'm going to be unveiling a plaque that I've donated showing all the places in the Cruden Bay area where Bram stayed, the different hotels that he stayed in, the different houses that he rented, the different spots that he sat and wrote his book. We know that for a fact. He's mentioned this because he also wrote 2 other books while he was there, The Mystery of the Sea and The Water's Mouth, besides Dracula. So we're going to be right at ground zero on May 26th. I also know that English Heritage is going to be trying to break the Guinness's Book of Records the most people dressed as a vampire at Whitby Abbey in Whitby while I'm in Cruden Bay. I can't be in two places at once. So some cool stuff going on for the 120th anniversary. I've also got, I come back. I'm going to be in Charleston, South Carolina. I'm going to be in different conventions throughout the year, kind of telling the story on how the story was written, how it was researched, how it's been merged into stage play and movies. So big year for me, and really, really glad you guys were interested enough to ask me all about these questions, because I love talking about it, as you can tell.
Definitely, and I got to close out, but it's been great. It's definitely one of my favorites shows ever. I love it so much. What is the website? What's the website you'd like to give out, or websites?
Yeah, if you wanted, number one, BramStokerEstate.com is where you can buy all my books and Bram Stoker bobblehead and all this other cool stuff. It's also got lots of information about the family and Bram as well. DacreStoker.com is my own personal website. I don't keep it up to date as much as I should, but I do Facebook, Dacre Stoker author. So come visit me there. I love to talk to people, and I also periodically post all the conventions that I'm going to be at, and shows like this one that I'm going to be on. So yeah, guys, thank you for hosting me. It's been a pleasure, especially since both of you have done really good research and have really good interest into this story. I love telling people about it, as you guys can tell.
If you've got enough time, I've actually got one more cool.
Tell it fast, Jay.
Okay.
We got not that much time.
You're in South Carolina. I went to school in Savannah, Georgia, and when I first went down there in '93, there was a resident vampire, an older gentleman who worked at the 7-Eleven. He walked around during the daytime dressed as Dracula, and there was a Renfield who had bugs all over him. He had wrenches, he had flies on string that would fly around him. So it was a weird city, but I love that place. So they're both probably dead by now, but I just thought you thought that would.
Did you ever go to the Pirate's House restaurant?
I never went to eat there, but I walked by it plenty of times. Yes,
that's where my wife was working there before she moved up to Aiken, where I grabbed her and married her.
Cool. It's haunted.
I know.
Okay.
Listen, that's why I told you about it, because it's
Nice.
got some cool stuff. So, Jeff, I know you got to jump. Thank you guys very, very much. I appreciate it.
And I'd hope to go to Transylvania one year. I've never been on a plane, but for that, I would wing it. That
would be a cool thing to do. Check that.
Also, there's a Bram Stoker Books a Million special Funko Pop. I don't know if you've seen that, but it's on eBay. You better grab it if you can get a hold of it. It's there.
I've seen it, but I have to promote my invention better. Bram Stoker bobblehead that I actually made. Which is actually a licensed product. Unfortunately, the Funko did not license with us, which kind of irritates. But this is the Bram bobblehead, licensed by the Bram Stoker Estate.
I'll have to check that out for sure. I like that.
And it really does bobble. And we've got the right color. I've got the Funko one too, but I gotta be true to the guy.
I understand. Myself. I'll have to check that out. Very cool. We appreciate it so much. We'll have to get you back. It's definitely a favorite show. Thanks so much. Take care.
Appreciate your time. Okay.
All right, everybody. We'll see you next week. Shamanism. So we love those shows. Take care, everybody. Have a good weekend. I'm going to watch The Northman later. I'm looking forward to that for sure. I know that guy's supposed to do a Nosferatu sometime. That guy that did The Witch and The Lighthouse. Crazy. He does weird movies, but they're really good. Take care, everybody. Have a good weekend. Good night, everybody.
Good night.